Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. I'm Noemi Coragna. I'm the Executive Director of Danube Institute, and I'd like to welcome everybody at our first event this season. It is really a pleasure to see so many faces and so many new faces. I think there has never been an event with so many new and young faces, which really pleases us a lot. For those who also very nice and very friendly old faces that I like. As I said, this is our first event, and I know that some of you have never been to the Danube Institute, so just a few words about us. The Institute's president is John O'Sullivan, who regrets it very much, but he cannot be here today. He's at a conference in Croatia, as far as I know. But just a few words about our institute. We operate under the auspices of Batyányi Foundation. We are a socially conservative, economically classical liberal institute, and in foreign policy we represent an Atlanticist view. We regularly organize debates. We'd like to invite speakers from both sides so that we can promote a real discussion, which we think would be very useful in Hungary. Our first event is about China and about Hungary's attitude to the rise of China. We are fortunate to have very outstanding speakers: David Morris, an Australian diplomat whom I will introduce shortly, and Gergely Salát, whom the Hungarian audience probably knows already. The spectacular rise of China leaves no one unaffected in the world, and it prompts very different answers from states. If you just think of President Trump's trade policies or the EU's ambivalent attitude, if you think just a couple of months ago, there was a incident in Beijing when 27 out of 28 ambassadors, EU ambassadors, signed a document denouncing the rise of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the only EU ambassador that did not sign this document was the Hungarian. That was the exception. So I think this one example already gives us enough reason to put this topic on the table and to invite Mr. Morris to talk about this question of relationship between China and Hungary. David Morris is an Australian diplomat. Right now he's a Pacific diplomat, actually. He is the Pacific Trade and Investment Commissioner in China. He's an Asia-Pacific expert. He's going to be the chair of the UN Asia-Pacific Business Forum in 2019. He has consulted for businesses and governments on trade and investment with China. So I don't think we would have a better choice for the topic. Just yours is the floor.
Well, thank you, Noemi. Do you want me to hold this, or yeah? Does that work for everybody? Can you hear me okay? Very good. All right, well, look, thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be here in Budapest, the city that I love and that I've been coming back to for nearly 30 years now. And it's great to see so many people here. So I'm very honoured to have so many people come out tonight. I'm going to make some very general statements as an introduction to a discussion, and I really encourage a discussion because I think the issues that I'd like to discuss are they're complex, and actually there are many different ways of looking at the rise of China, and nobody has quite figured out what the answer is. These are very complex issues, and in fact China itself is an extremely complex place. Trying to generalize and trying to make assumptions and then make generalizations about China is like trying to make assumptions and generalizations about Europe. China is a whole civilization to itself with 5,000 years of history. It's a It's a civilization that, of course, has its people spread across many different geographic areas, from the Pacific, where Chinese have lived for 200 years, all through the Asian region, through East Asia, Southeast Asia, there are Chinese people. But in what we refer to as the mainland of China, you have incredible diversity of cultures, of language, of food, just the same as the diversity of Europe, in fact, on of course a much larger scale than Europe itself. And so I say that as a really important preliminary comment, because anything I'm going to say now is going to be a great generalisation, and therefore open to being picked apart and criticised, and I'm very happy to be picked apart and for you to find flaws in the very general comments that I'm going to make. But I think it's important to start with that comment. So, the rise of China. China has been on a path for 40 years. This year, in fact, is the 40th anniversary of what the Chinese refer to as the reform and opening up period. So it began in late 1978 when Deng Xiaoping finally was back in a position of authority, and he and his people had been looking around and they'd been trying to resolve the dilemmas that China was facing. China had been through the horrors, as we know, of the Cultural Revolution. It was in chaos. The whole political experiment was in real danger of collapsing, and Deng Xiaoping and others looked at what was working. This is a very Chinese, a very Asian approach to very pragmatically look at what works in different places and to try and learn from what works. And these Chinese leaders looked at the places in the 70s that were booming. And of course the 70s was the period of the Asian tigers. And so you had these incredible success stories. You'd had that incredible development of Japan, of course, but in the 70s you had Singapore, you had Hong Kong, you had, of course, Taiwan. These economies that had pulled themselves up, had developed so successfully. They were mildly authoritarian regimes, which didn't cause any discomfort to the Chinese. They were countries that had invested in infrastructure. They'd invested in a very capital-intensive form of development, and they had gone out into the world and they had sold their goods using their competitive advantage, which largely was usually cheap labour or intellectual innovation, like in the case of Singapore, and taking what they had out to the world as open economies, opening up as exporters to the world. And this, to take these as models and to apply them to China, which, as we know, was a Leninist state that had experimented with various forms of command economy with absolutely disastrous results. To apply these lessons from these other smaller, quite uniquely different in many respects case studies, but they were largely Confucian societies. So there were lessons that China thought it could learn. To apply these lessons was a huge gamble, really, looking back on it. And probably those of us at the time who observed that happening at the beginning of the reform and opening up probably didn't take it too seriously initially. Initially, I think the rest of the world took a very much a wait-and-see approach to how long is this going to last? You know, is this just the next experiment? Is this just the next lurch to another big crazy scheme in China that's all going to collapse and be replaced a few years later by another one? That had been the history of China. But from 1978 until now, we've seen this phenomenal continuity, actually. And of course, the success of taking that model and building a Chinese version of Singapore, essentially, on a much grander scale, has been, on any measure, phenomenally successful. The most important measure, I think, is when you think about human welfare, because at the end of the day, we're all here for human welfare, whether it's for ourselves or our families. And when we think beyond our families, if we think of the whole world, the biggest thing that has happened in the world in this century, arguably in all time, has been this dramatic increase in human welfare in China, from being a dirt-poor society to now being a society in which there is a middle class that's larger than Europe. A middle class who have lifestyles that are comparable to the lifestyles that we have, all of us in this room, on a population scale more than Europe. This is the most phenomenal shift in human welfare. In fact, when all of the world's leaders got together in 2015 in New York at the United Nations to pat themselves on the back for achieving the Millennium Development Goals, which they had set in the year 2000. Those famous goals that the world had committed to bring down poverty and to address many other issues around the world. They congratulated themselves on achieving this massive reduction in poverty, which is the biggest achievement of the world when you think of the scale of it. But what they really didn't point out in 2015 is what we all know is the reality is that was largely China that actually delivered that massive reduction. It wasn't so much in India, it wasn't so much in Indonesia, it wasn't so much in Africa. However, there is a global reduction in poverty happening. So we're in very exciting times, I can say, as someone with a Pacific approach to the world as opposed to an Atlanticist one. Not such exciting times perhaps if you take an Atlanticist approach, but in terms of the Pacific approach to the world, human welfare has dramatically improved, and that's largely been in the East Asian region where that's happened. And so that's the starting point, I think, for us to think about what's going on. This is a big shift. If we go back 10 years ago, this time 10 years ago, China had already had 30 years of this process. So China had gone out looking for, it was already a big economy, it was already internationalising, its big firms already had great experience in key areas of infrastructure development and a whole range of manufacturing, obviously. China's labour costs were already increasing, and China's middle class was growing. So 10 years ago, all of the trends that we see today, magnified, were already there. And the Chinese had already started going to places to source resources and raw materials for their growth. So they'd been going for some 30 years or so to Australia, for example, to my home country, because Australia was an open economy, export-driven, resource-rich, and with the slowdown of Japan, Australia was looking for new customers, and so Australia started delivering the coal and the iron ore and those resources that were inputs into the Chinese economic miracle. And China also looked to Canada and to Brazil and other sources of raw materials. So it was already doing that. It was increasingly also, even 10 years ago, starting to look for the middle class that was growing for the kinds of things that the middle class was looking for. So for example, the middle class of China was starting to look for places to invest themselves. We were just having a chat before we started about the Chinese migrants who are finding their way all around the world. Chinese middle class were looking for places to invest in real estate. So they went to places like Sydney and Vancouver and New York, and they started in more recent times to come to Europe as well. They started to look for places to educate their children so that they could have the opportunities of an international education, which again is a very characteristic thing of the Chinese culture, to look for ways to learn from outside. So the middle class increasingly were looking to go out 10 years ago. And then 10 years ago, another big change happens. So not only have you got this trend already of China growing, but of course the Atlantic economies collapse. So you have from Wall Street to Portugal and Ireland and everything that happened here. You have the collapse of the major economies of the Western world, with the exception of those like Australia and Canada that of course were deeply already engaged with the Chinese economy. We continued to grow. There was no economic crisis in the countries linked to China. But the Atlantic economies collapse. And so China finds itself 10 years ago in this unique position. It's the rising power. It knows it's the rising power. Those countries engaged with it know that it's the rising power. But the rest of the world hasn't really noticed so much at this stage. And all of a sudden, China's the one that is there in the pole position. It's the country that everybody's looking to help hold it together. Chinese finance held the world economy together. In the year 2008, 10 years ago, China had zero net exports because of the collapse of its export markets in the US and Europe, which were obviously major export markets and still are for China. But they collapsed completely. But China continued to grow at 10%. Because China shifted to internal production, to a huge pump prime of its economy, which any economy does in that sort of crisis, and it continued to go out and continued to look for more international opportunities and started a big shift into a more services economy as well. So all of this is happening at the time of the Atlantic economy's collapse. And you have Americans like Bob Zoellick, and you have people all across the world saying to China, you guys have really got to take more of a leadership role now. Your banks are underpinning the world financial system. You have this, you're becoming the world's great trading power. You have the potential to hold the economy together. So we need you to take more of a leadership role in the international financial institutions in the world. And these were commonly heard phrases 10 years ago in the West. We want China to take more of a leadership role. It's ironic because today you don't hear it so much because China is starting to take a leadership role. But 10 years ago it wasn't. It was still biding its time. It was still operating very much under the Deng Xiaoping mantra of, let's grow, but let's bide our time. There's no rush. China will eventually return to being a great economy in the world, but there's no rush to take a leadership role. But 10 years ago, it all changed. And so you have the emergence of a leadership and of a generation in China in the last 10 years that is now starting to think of itself in very different terms from the way China has thought of itself for arguably more than 150 years. It is thinking of itself again, like it used to in the old days, as the leader, as the leading economy, as the centre, as the middle kingdom, which is of course what China really means. It is thinking of itself as the leader in the world. So China now is the greatest contributor to United Nations peacekeeping forces. China now is of course the world's largest trading power. And China now is investing and giving aid throughout the developing world. It's not just going to the old safe havens like the Australia, Canada, US anymore, although its top investment destinations still are Australia, Canada and the US, by the way, but it's actually looking all across the world for opportunities because it's seeing itself now as a global power. And the really big change is that the change within the Chinese economy itself. China has already developed in its eastern seaboard. It has already built all of this infrastructure, so it's built companies, these giant firms, many of them state-owned because of their particular model. They've marketised their system, but the state still has a huge role, of course. But some of them private sector as well. And they've increasingly developed these skills in building ports and building airports and building fast trains on a scale that the rest of the world has never done. And to standards and to the quality exactly the same as what you see in Japan or elsewhere, which we would not have said a decade ago even. But today, when you ride on a fast train between Beijing and Shanghai that takes you 4 hours, you are riding on state-of-the-art technology developed in China. Not the bullet trains of 5 years ago that were German technology, but today it's Chinese technology. So you have these companies with this capacity. And so they're going out into the world and they're looking for opportunities. And because China has risen and because it's grown on its own model, based on its own model, which it has worked and which they now have great confidence in. It's very much like the Americans of a century ago who had great confidence in their system, or the Brits before that. Each great power rises with great confidence. And China too has seen that its model has worked. And so the leaders in its society, the business leaders, political leaders, have developed the same kind of hubris, you could argue, that the Americans have, that the British Empire had before that, the Germans and Japanese and other empires develop. It's a natural thing. It's something that those of us who are free to criticise, I think, we ought to question it too, because hubris can be a very dangerous thing. But there's no doubt that China of today sees itself as having this leading role. And Xi Jinping, who has consolidated himself into power, which is no mean achievement in a political system as complex as China's. He has consolidated power in a way that really nobody has done since Mao, and he has developed, along with this great success story, Xi has developed this narrative that is a narrative of success. And so anybody who's benefiting, and that middle class of so many hundreds of millions, most of these people feel nothing but benefit, economic benefit. They may still have their concerns about social issues and food safety and their limitations on their freedom of speech and things like that. There's no doubt that there are irritations and concerns, but the fundamentals of economic security are very strong for that middle class. So this narrative is an extremely powerful one. I would argue it's as powerful as the American narrative of 100 years ago was. It has taken root, and it will be a very difficult narrative to shift unless circumstances change, which of course the world is complex and circumstances could change. So I'm making my grand generalisations here and happy to be picked apart on them. But assuming that the trend continues, that narrative is a very powerful one. And so within that narrative within China, remember we're talking about 1.4 billion people within mainland China, and then we're talking about many, many millions of Chinese people across the world as well, who share in this discussion, who don't always necessarily agree with it because they might live in different societies where they've developed different views, but they're part of the discussion though, because within Chinese civilization, within the Chinese language, these discussions are going on. They're vibrant discussions on WeChat, which is like the Chinese version of WhatsApp, and there are vibrant discussions about all of these things. And so in Chinese terms, there are slogans and there are phrases, and this is a very Chinese thing, to come up with very elegant phrases that sum up an ambition or a vision or a goal. And so a beautiful little phrase that might have some beautiful looking characters, 3 or 4 characters that give us the opportunity to imagine a way forward, a direction, is a very Chinese thing. And so Xi Jinping, as a very clever leader, has developed a number of these slogans himself. And one of them, of course, that we're all aware of is this one that started as a concept of a new Silk Road. So in 2013, 5 years ago, it's not long ago when you think of it, all of this is happening so fast. 5 years ago, Xi Jinping goes to Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan, of course, is this resource-rich, undeveloped country right next door to China with massive potential for development. And so there's Xi Jinping, full of his confidence that China's done it. You guys can do it too. And in fact, we can help you because we've got all these firms that know how to build ports, and they know how to build airports and railways and roads, and there are all those impassable passes in Kazakhstan. There are all these challenges, but hey, we've done it in China, so we can come and do it here in Kazakhstan. So she announces this grand ambition in this beautiful phrase in Chinese that of this new Silk Road that he developed as one belt, one road over time. And so the concept is that China can help develop a new Silk Road all the way across the Eurasian landmass, all the way to Europe, just like in the good old days. Before the humiliation of China by the European powers 150 years ago, before all of that bad period in Chinese history, China was, of course, the leading economy in the world for thousands of years. It was the centre of the world, and it had these benevolent trading relationships with places as far distant as far Europe. You guys call our part of the world Far East, so I'm going to call Europe the Far Europe. There were these long trading routes, and China was the central power and had these very peaceful trading routes. So what a clever concept for Xi Jinping to come up with, that we'll have a new Silk Road, that we'll equally develop these peaceful trading relationships. We're not going to be a hegemon like the United States or like other great powers. When they rose, they might have wanted to take over the world. We don't want that. We just want trade. And we want to invest, and we want to come and help you to develop as well, just as we have, because we have all this surplus capacity to help you with. And so he took that concept and he promoted it across the world, not just to Kazakhstan, but all the way to Europe, all the way to Africa, all the way to the South Pacific. And in fact, it was in Indonesia the following year that he elaborated that this could be a maritime Silk Road as well, that actually he realised that just talking about the link to Eurasia on land wasn't really very significant, because when you think of it, trade on land is about 10% of world trade. 90% of world trade is by sea. So maritime trade, all that trade that goes through the South China Sea, for example, I mean, that's where it's at. That's actually what matters. Maritime trade is actually the future. It's certainly where most of the trade in the Asia Pacific and across to the Americas happens. And so he elaborated this concept that it was a land and a maritime collection of belts and roads, and so this concept of one belt, one road. At the time, I used to point out to my friends who were in relatively influential places in China that I thought in Chinese it was a beautiful phrase, but I pointed out that I thought in English, to some of our ears at least, we might not hear it in the same way that the Chinese intended it. I think that Xi Jinping intended this, or whoever came up with it, some clever person who suggested it to him. I think I might know who that was, but obviously Xi Jinping invented it. It was a very clever phrase, but for English-speaking people, it sounds a bit like an American phrase, my way or the highway. It sounds a bit. It sounds pretty aggressive, actually. It doesn't. One belt, one road. It's our way. So I don't think they necessarily listened to me, but I think a few other English-speaking people pointed this out to the powers that be in Beijing. And so in recent years, they've amended the phrase, and it's now the Belt and Road Initiative. It's no longer about my way or the highway. It's now very much the language that China is using is this is an inclusive, win-win, mutual benefit approach to our economic development. We've stepped up to the plate. We're going to be the world economic leader, but we want to do it inclusively. We want to do it with everyone, and we want to come and help you build your infrastructure, build your trade links. And so it's with that intention, that stated intention, that China comes to the far distant places, like here in Hungary, and is travelling all around the world looking for economic opportunities. So when China comes here, they have, just like they have in other regions of the world, they've thought, well, this is a region that we don't really understand very well, and so we need to have a whole lot of dialogue. And this again is a very Chinese thing. The Chinese like to not only study carefully to learn what lessons they can learn in a place, but also have dialogue and develop a much better understanding through discussion, through learning who they can trust, and having deep conversations. And so those of us who live in China find this all the time. I'm constantly in meetings where I'm meeting someone for the first time, and you sit and you have a grand, big conversation, a bit like what I'm doing now. We have this big picture conversation that allows the person to suss you out. Does that phrase translate? That's perhaps an Australian phrase, but it allows you to work out where the person is coming from. It allows you to figure out, in Chinese terms, which is a very hierarchical society, it allows them to figure out what status do you have, what's your capacity to articulate your vision, and also for the Chinese partner to figure out, do I want to partner with this person and can I trust them? And it's not until you've gone and had a big banquet and possibly had several more meetings and more discussions that you'll actually get to a discussion about the real business that they want to do. That's going to come much later. So it's entirely different from the American who sits down and immediately says, right, what business are we going to do? And so when the Chinese came out to these places that are far distant, like far distant Europe, they decided, well, the best thing we can do is group together small countries as in groupings and start this process of building relationships and understanding where they're coming from, and then we can figure out who we can trust and who we can work with. So in Africa, China developed this grouping of all of the African countries. They've just had a meeting in Beijing a couple of weeks ago where Xi Jinping offered them Li Keqiang, the Premier, offered them another $60 billion worth of investment, which is quite phenomenal when you think of it for Africa, if it all transpires into reality. Another thing the Chinese like to do is make grand announcements, by the way. Those grand announcements sometimes take time to come into fruition. In my part of the world, in the Pacific, China came to the Pacific and they got together all of the leaders of the Pacific as a grouping. They'd already developed their links to Australia and New Zealand, but all of the smaller Pacific Island countries, they got them together as a group and they formulated a grouping that they meet regularly and talk to them as a group so they can have this conversation, this process of figuring out where are these countries coming from, can we, and then of course, if you're really cynical about it, what they can then do is come back and one by one bilaterally deal once they've got a better sense of what the regional realities are. And so in this part of the world, as we know, China has developed the 16+1 mechanism and is going through exactly that same process of developing relationships, figuring out which are the countries that would like to partner with China the most. And this brings me to where I'll make some comments as an outsider, and then hopefully we'll open it all up to discussion. But as an outsider to Hungary, I can only make some comments as an outsider, as someone who's living in Beijing but who visits here fairly regularly. And I'm more than happy for you to probe and help me to refine my understanding of what Hungary's doing. But here's my outsider's perspective. Hungary, under Viktor Orban, is looking at China and seeing a great opportunity. Hungary, as I see it, has, just like China has its historical imperatives that are driving it and that feed that Chinese narrative. Equally, I think my read of it as a foreigner and an outsider is that Hungary too has its, as every country does, has its historical imperatives, and Hungary's had a particularly rough time. Hungary's had a series of major powers who have treated Hungary pretty poorly, and Hungary has never had, or very rarely, had the territory or the strength to really stand on its own. It hasn't got those Carpathian mountains. It hasn't got the size or the power, and so Hungary, it seems to me, as an outsider, please forgive me if I'm wrong, needs to either accommodate other great powers or be dominated by them or balance them. So there are various opportunities for different strategies, but certainly you can't go it alone, and certainly you can't write the rules. You've got to somehow find a way of, as I say, accommodating big powers, competing with them, or being absorbed by one, or somehow existing in a balance. And so clearly being accommodating a great power or being absorbed by one, and the obvious one in this era is the European Union, is obviously attractive for many reasons, but it's obviously not the perfect solution for other reasons. And I'm not going to go into an analysis of domestic politics, but it seems to me that for Orban, there's an opportunity here to balance by, yes, being part of the European Union, but also demonstrating to the European Union in this way, as in some others, that Hungary actually has its own solutions and can, giving itself some more freedom of manoeuvre. And so having relationships with other great powers, such as a rising China, gives Hungary another option. It's a hedging opportunity, an opportunity for Hungary to bring in some extra benefits that it may not get from Europe itself, or to actually stimulate perhaps a greater interest from the EU to look after Hungary's interests if it fears that actually China's going to play a major role. Now, as we heard in the introduction, some of the other EU countries are not so keen on the rise of China, just as we know the US isn't, as we can see from the US actions in recent times. It's very easy to frame in geopolitical terms. It's very easy to say, well, we were the big kid on the block. We don't want a new kid on the block, so we're going to block them in every way we can. That's a natural thing for a big power. So it's a natural thing for the EU to go along with the US and to frame China as a threat, whether or not it is, which is an interesting issue to then discuss later, no doubt. But for Hungary, Hungary's sitting here not particularly threatened by China. There's no equivalence between how perhaps the EU feels threatened by China, but there's no equivalence at all. China's no threat to Hungary. China actually, as far as Hungary goes, is a source potentially of significant investment. The Chinese would look at Hungary and think, well, here is a strategic location. We can, just as we're building these belts and roads all around the world, we can build supply chains and logistics connections, transport routes for goods and services that go in a north-south trajectory, which is very underdeveloped in Europe. We can go from the port that China picked up for a bargain price when the Greek economy collapsed. China can go from Piraeus in Greece up through Belgrade, can build a fast train up to Budapest and build all the way up to Poland and build links out to Germany. So build these trading connections deep into Europe, which is it's a win-win, right? Because that benefits China and it builds this enormous trading and logistics infrastructure that for Hungary becomes a logistical centre, arguably in the centre of all of that, if it designs it right, if it takes the benefits. And Hungary doesn't have any particular need as an independent nation to take views on what China might be doing in the South China Sea or other things that might actually be issues that are particularly important to other countries around the world and might even be important at the EU scale. But Hungary itself can probably find ways of accommodating China to encourage China to bring that investment. Chinese tourism as well. I mean, this is another part of the story that you haven't even seen the beginning, but you're seeing the growth though. So 30% growth in the last year of Chinese tourism to Hungary, which is very interesting. So I come from a country where we have 1.7 million Chinese visitors a year. In Hungary last year there were 277,000, but if you're growing at 30%, and remember the Chinese tourists are the highest spending tourists in the world. They spend more money than any other tourist, so that's the kind of tourist you want. You want tourists who are going to come and spend money and who want to eat in your best restaurants and who want to buy souvenirs and artefacts and who might even want to invest in real estate or something. That's a really attractive kind of tourist. So there are all these opportunities that Hungary has that makes it a very interesting case study, actually, that it might be far Europe, it might be a long way away from China. And that's a good thing in a sense that you don't feel threatened by China, like perhaps some countries that are a bit closer to China might. And you've got this potential, this political potential to hedge between the EU and China. So, I think all of this raises a whole lot of questions about what will these projects look like, what are the standards of transparency and governance of Chinese business, and they are not the same as EU standards. They are not at that level of development. Having said that, though, China is changing very fast, as and that's why I gave those introductory comments about how fast it has changed. And what we might say about the governance standards of a Chinese company today might not be true in another 10 years. The speed of change is enormous. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that was another part of China's vision of developing leadership in the world. It saw this big gap in funding. It created this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It invited the world to join it, and almost everyone did apart from the United States, who lobbied everyone desperately not to join it. But countries have joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and it is governed at the highest standards. It is governed at exactly the same standards of governance as the Asian Development Bank or the IMF. It's just not dominated by America. That's the difference. It's dominated by its largest shareholders, and those shareholdings are entirely open to whoever wants to contribute. So it's a very interesting model, and I think an interesting example of the fact that we shouldn't generalise. We shouldn't say that all Chinese investment is not going to be of the highest quality. However, I think we should be honest about it, and the fact is that there are high levels of corruption in China, as in any authoritarian society. It's quite a common thing around much of the world, of course, but in China there are deep problems with corruption, and so naturally some of that is being exported, and so there is a downside to all of this that I think all of us, not just Hungary, but all of us who are at the receiving end of Chinese investment have to look at all of this as, yes, it's an opportunity, but we also need to look at it very clearly. What are the potential problems, and we need to find solutions to those problems. I've got lots of ideas about how we might do that, but I think I've probably talked for long enough to stimulate a discussion. So why don't I leave it there for the moment?
Thank you very much for this kind of intimate account of Chinese history, and certainly very, at least in me, it has provoked a lot of questions, and I'm sure that Gergely will respond to those questions. The most important being is that how can Hungary ignore the EU reservations if we are an EU member state? And shall we ignore the reservations the EU have, or the threats the EU feels if we are as an EU member state? If the EU feels threatened, shall we not feel that threat, or how can we go about that? And also, if China deals with us as a member of the 16+1 group and not as an EU member, is that not a trick? Is it an opportunity, or is it a trick? That's, I think, is also a very important question. And of course, the most important question is whether the Belt and Road Initiative is really an opportunity that Hungary can take without any reservations, or is it something that we have to modify in a way that it really becomes a win-win situation? So I'm sure that Gergely will address all these questions. I'd like to introduce Gergely Salat, who is one of the most outstanding China experts in Hungary. He's an associate professor at the Pázmány Péter Catholic University. He studied in Peking as well as at ELTE, where he earned his PhD in sinology in 2006. His main research area is the history of Chinese law and institutions, and he's also engaged in the study of contemporary Chinese politics and society. And he's an author of a long list of books and articles, which I won't name now one by one, but I'd like to give the floor to Gergely.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me. David pointed out that the rise of China brings about a lot of opportunities for Hungary, and even though I'm not an expert of Hungarian politics and even not of Hungarian Chinese relations, I would like to say a few words about this aspect, especially that the title of this event includes Hungary in it, so I think I must stick to Chinese-Hungarian relations. As we all know, the second government of Viktor Orban initiated this opening to the East policy when it was formed in 2010. But actually, if we look at the facts, we can see that this whole opening to the East policy started a little earlier under the previous government in 2003, when Péter Menyesi, Prime Minister, visited Beijing and started a new era of Hungarian-Chinese relations. When Viktor Orban came to power in 2010, there was a new situation in the world caused by the financial crisis. And there was also a new situation, I think, in the thinking of the Hungarian people, and actually it's not only Hungary, it's the whole Eastern European region. Most of these countries in this 16+1 formation joined the EU in 2004. And I think many of us can remember that before that time, there was some kind of promise. There was some kind of promise from a part of the elites of these countries that after we join the EU, Hungary will be a paradise, and Czech Republic and all these countries will be a paradise. We were all waiting for a miracle. We can all remember this billboard saying that when we join the EU, we can all open a cookie shop in Wien, Austria, and stuff like that. And it just didn't come. We joined the EU, and it did not bring a very rapid development of the country, and it did not bring a very rapid development of the living standard of the people. Moreover, in 2008, this whole Western system that we wanted to join so much collapsed. And I think it was quite natural from the part of the previous government, as also from the government of Viktor Orban, that it tried to find some solution for our problems, looked at as the problems of the West somewhere else, and I think they just checked it on the internet where the buzz is, where the economic development is, and it's China. So even though Viktor Orban didn't have a very good relationship with China before that, actually it was very critical of China because of the Tibetan issues and stuff like that, and human rights. When he came to power, he suddenly turned to China, and he initiated this opening to the East policy. But I think if we look at the numbers, the opening to the East policy just does not work. The trade statistics, the investment statistics all show us that actually Hungarian Chinese trade is going up, and we have a lot of not a lot of, but some investment from China. But the miracle did not happen again, and actually the trends are the same, not with just Hungary and China, but with Hungary and Germany, Hungary and Brazil, Hungary and all the countries in the world, because trade is going up with China everywhere in the world. So we are nothing special in that, even though we have this very special political attention paid to China. So I think so far this opening to the China policy, if we boil it down to the fact, is a failure. I'm not saying that it will never work in the future, but so far it did not really contribute to the development of the Hungarian economy, and it did not really contribute to the elevation of the position in Hungary, neither in economic sense nor in political sense. The opening to the East policy actually, I think, was a good idea. The Hungary and most of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe have this problem that they are too dependent on Western Europe. I think in economic terms, to put it bluntly, Hungary is something like a colony of Germany. Most of our trade, most of our investment goes to Germany, come from Germany and other Western European powers and economies. And it is natural from the part of Hungarian decision makers that they want to diversify our relationship, but so far they were not successful in that. There are a lot of reasons for that. I think one is that Hungarian politicians tend to overestimate the importance of politics. I think most Hungarian politicians believe that if they go to China, they tap the back of Xi Jinping or Li Keqiang or whoever receives them, and they say some nice words, then the money starts to flow to Hungary from China. We have this illusion, but it just doesn't work like that. So I think much less politics and more business is needed in that respect. I think it's not the politicians but the businessmen are the ones who should be much more active. There's also one question for which I don't have the answer. Whether Viktor Orban has some grand vision, some big picture about the rise of China. If we listen to his speeches, it seems that he has this grand vision about the decline of the West and the rise of the East. But if we look at what is actually happening, we can see that this vision is somewhat superficial. It's very shallow. It's all about, okay, the East is rising, but what shall we do? And we cannot see the concrete steps, the concrete measures, how we shall use the opportunities provided by the rise of China and the rise of Asia as a whole. So I think even if he has some grand vision, in which I am not completely sure, then it is still not enough, and the daily work of building much more meaningful, real relations with China still need to be done. Noemi asked about the criticism from the EU. This is, I think, a very fashionable topic in the EU in the past 1 or 2 or 3 years, that China is trying to dividing the EU, and China is buying up Eastern Europe, and China is trying to get position in Eastern Europe in order to divide Western Europe and use Eastern Europe something like a Trojan horse in the European Union. I'm not sure if that's true. I think that at present it is not the interest of China to divide the EU. EU is its most important trading partner, most important market, and politically and militarily is a very weak unit, so China does not need to weaken it anymore. Actually, I think China needs more powerful EU. That would be beneficial to China if the European Union were stronger. As for the criticism, I think there are two reasons behind those. One is the political developments in Eastern Europe, especially in Hungary, which can be described as an illiberal turn. And it sounds logical that if the leader is doing an illiberal turn, then he's turning to these Eastern authoritarian regimes like China, whatever, and tries to emulate them. But I don't think that the illiberal turn in some of these countries has anything to do with China. I don't think China actually acts like a model for Viktor Orban or whoever. Maybe Singapore is much more something like a model. Sometimes they actually admit that they try to learn from Singapore, even though I don't think they know anything about the Singaporean model. So I think these political kind of criticisms are unfounded. And the other is, of course, Western European companies are afraid of having competition from China. It's quite clear that if German or Austrian or French construction companies have to face competition from cheap Chinese companies in Eastern Europe, that is against their interest. So they will do everything, all the kind of lobbying, also including the political field, including the European Union, to stop the Chinese companies coming to Eastern Europe. It's quite clear if a Chinese company is building, let's say, the Belgrade-Budapest railway, then it is not the German companies that is building it. So it's a loss for the German companies. And that's also one of the reasons why the Hungarian government is criticized. Actually, I am quite sure that in this very special case, this Budapest-Belgrade railway, there will be some way to include some German companies in some part of the project. As far as I know, something like that is already going on now. I also feel that there is some kind of double standard from the side of the Western European critics of this CEE or 16+1 cooperation, because Germany had its opening to the East in the 1980s, like 30 years ago. All the Western European countries had their opening to the East, even if they didn't call it that, like that, but they had some opening to China 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago. If we take a look at the German economy, we can see that it's completely intertwined with the Chinese economy, and the French economy and British economy and all the economies of Western Europe are much more intertwined. They are much more linked to the Chinese economy than the Eastern European ones. Like, I think Germany would collapse if it didn't do business with China. They have really close connections with China, and compared to those relations, the Hungarian-Chinese relations, or any Central or Eastern European countries' relations with China is very minimal. It's almost nothing. So I think that when Western Europeans are criticizing CE countries for turning to China, they are applying double standard. Even though I have a lot of problems with the Hungarian opening to the East policy, but I think that these criticisms are unjust. That's for now, and how shall we go on?
Speaking of the 16+1, recently there's been a bit less talk about it. I think this last Sofia summit was more quiet than the previous ones. Do you think that, is it a real alternative to talking to this? Is the 16+1 a real alternative to talking to the EU for China, or is it a competing entity? Is it a real group? I don't know whether there has been any real results in this 16+1, or it's been more like promises and great expectations on our side.
I don't think from a Chinese perspective that they expect to be a competitor. I think they see the 16+1, as I described it earlier, as a process of getting to know a neighbourhood, and I think that they would argue that it is a complementary process to their relationship that they have with the EU. I agree with Gergely that China's interests would dictate that they would like to see a strong Europe. The last thing they want to see is a weakened EU, and the last thing they want to see is fragmentation or economic problems in Europe. Europe's a very important market for China. It's also a very important balancing power to the United States. So whether you're looking at it from an economic or a geopolitical perspective, it's in China's interests for Europe to be strong. There's no interest that I can see that China would be wanting to unpick European integration. And so China, I think, genuinely is coming to the 16+1 to get to know people, to build relationships, to have that dialogue. Yes, they make announcements. They love to make announcements, and just like they did with the African leaders the other day in Beijing and in Sofia, they announced another 500 million for this Central Europe fund that's administered out of Hong Kong, which again is very well administered, I should say. I know the people who are managing that fund. But finding the projects for the fund is a different matter from the discussion. The 16+1 is just the discussion. It's just the leaders talking. But actually finding the projects, and this is the point about the investments, this comes down to business. It's the businesses of this region have got an opportunity here to present long-term projects for infrastructure and logistics and other industry development to Chinese funders. And that could well be in partnership with other EU partners. It doesn't have to be uniquely just with Chinese partners, although there's no doubt the Chinese prefer to fund projects that they can build and deliver. But the Chinese are getting a little bit conscious of the criticism in recent times and have been looking around increasingly to partner with third countries. So, for example, in one of the countries that I represent in China is Papua New Guinea. And in Papua New Guinea, the Chinese are always saying to me, we really want to partner with Australian companies because Australian companies know Papua New Guinea, they've operated there for decades, and we can bring the finance, you guys have got the expertise, we want to work in a three-way partnership. And we're seeing in Thailand where the Chinese are partnering even with Japanese, who they have incredible geostrategic tensions with and historical grievances, but Chinese and Japanese firms are working together to build the fast rail system in Thailand. And I agree, I think there's potential to think laterally here and to think in terms of if China's not a threat to the EU, perhaps there are opportunities here to find EU partners to work with projects, to develop projects in Central Europe. Having said all of that, that's just talking as a practitioner, as I am, working in that field of trying to match investors with projects. What gets in the way here is the politics and the geopolitics, because the way the world is responding to the rise of China, it happens so fast that really we're still in this process of figuring out how to deal with it. And I think that we're seeing people, we all have a tendency to develop stereotypes when we don't know much about something. We all do it. And my country, Australia, suffers from terrible stereotypes by people who've never been there. Hungary suffers from stereotypes, people who've never been here. Until you know a place and learn about it, you develop a stereotype. And this is exactly what's happened with China in recent years. And in the leadership of the world and in the international relations world, and I know there are some international relations students from Corvinus here tonight, in the international relations world there are two general camps. There are the realists, like the guys who sit in Washington and they look at the map of the world and they think, well, the world is a place of competing powers, and these competing powers are always going to be in conflict with one another, and any new power is going to be a threat to the existing power, so therefore China's their enemy. And that's really simplistic. It's a simplistic way to describe some very intelligent people, but it's generally a trend that we see in the world, in the realist world of realist foreign policy. And then you have your liberal foreign policy. Liberal foreign policy came out of America, by the way. It was an American invention, but it's been taken to heart in Western Europe. So you have this liberal idealism that comes from American idealism of the last century, and this idealism and we heard all about it in 1989. This great belief that a liberal Europe could live by values and could have these liberal values could be our saviour, and in fact we can export those to the world. It's an ironic thing, I have to say, as a non-European, for Europeans to have such an idealistic view of the world. When you think of what Europe did to the world, they didn't really apply their values, just as America didn't always apply its values. So there's this values approach that we can erect a world order based on the highest moral principles, which sounds wonderful, by the way. I mean, it sounds very convincing, and so it's a serious school of thought. And I think many people sit in Brussels and other places believing that we can have this high moral view of the world, and they frame China not in the same way as the realists in Washington who say China's got to be our threat, but the liberals look at China and think, well, my God, they're not living up to our standards. The way that they are treating their Uyghur population in Xinjiang is appalling. They're locking people up, they're re-educating them. Not to mention that those sort of things have happened throughout European history, but they're happening today in China, and they're awful. They actually are awful. And so liberal international relations people will tend to look at that and think, well, therefore we don't want to deal with that country. That country actually is a country we'd rather not deal with, and we don't need to. And in fact, you could take the view as Hungary. You could very easily take the view that you don't need to, because as you say, Germany's your largest market. You've got this potential to just be absorbed into the larger EU. But if you are absorbed into the larger EU, this would be my point, and I think this is my point about Viktor Orban. If you're absorbed into the EU, you will find yourself led and directed by the prevailing mentality of the EU. And I think that's what's happening here. That's my read of the politics, is that Viktor Orban wants something else. He wants to be able to balance. He wants to be in the EU, I think, but I think he wants also to be able to not agree with the prevailing views in the EU when it suits him. And he looks at China and he says things like, well, they're at least not going to tell us what to do, and they're not. So it's an opportunity.
About the 16+1, okay.
About the 16+1, I think these 16 CE countries, to putting them together as a unit was a Chinese idea, a very practical idea that makes the work of the Chinese easier. I mean, 16 countries, that's 16 prime ministers, 16 presidents, 16 ambassadors, so that's too much. Too many people in too many countries that you have to deal with. So they just group them together. And then there is one summit every year. That's enough. They don't have to deal with them one by one. The problem is that this is also not working. I think the Chinese actually, I'm quite surprised how little these countries can cooperate with each other. It's very interesting. They are, when I talk to them, they always say that they thought that, I mean, these countries are close to each other. They have common history, very similar culture, languages, whatever. Why they cannot cooperate with each other? They are very surprised about that. But that's one of the problem. It's actually a problem of our mentality that a Hungarian and a Slovakian and a Czech or Polish or whatever companies, politicians, whoever look at each other as competitors, not as partners. And instead of working together to get some Chinese-funded project here, instead of we are competing for the money of the Chinese and for investment, and it just doesn't work. I think that's one of the problem with the failures of this 16+1 cooperation. And it also looks as if China started to take notice of the criticisms of these Western European politicians and companies and whatever. So they, even though we still had a summit this year in Sofia. It was the press coverage and the buzz about it was much less than before. And I think that there's also one more thing, that all the European countries, just like in the case of joining EU, we were all waiting for some miracle for the Chinese money and Chinese investment or whatever. And it's like this 16+1 has been going on for like 5 years or something like that. And as nothing has really happened, we became disappointed in the Chinese now. So the politicians and also the public of these countries are much less optimistic about the Chinese relations.
Thank you. Speaking of politics, you said that, David, you said that Chinese do not want to export their values, but there is still some political criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative from the Western side, that it's an asymmetrical political relation. They want to insert political influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, not necessarily talking about the criticisms of Chinese domestic policy and human rights, but Chinese geopolitics, Belt and Road being a tool of Chinese geopolitics, and I think it's also part of the new things I cannot pronounce plan of being a leading power of the world. Is that a political? Can it be seen as a political tool as well as a win-win situation for all participants?
Well, I think this is the big question, isn't it? And And as I said, I think that the commentators, the political and academic elites that are looking at these questions are, as the Americans say, putting the wagons in the circle. You know, people are assuming that China's a threat, either from that realist perspective or from a liberal perspective. Living in China as I do, and hearing the Chinese view of it, I'll tell you the Chinese view, and it doesn't mean I'm necessarily 100% convinced by it, by the way, but I think we've got to listen to each view and understand what actually is going on in each place. And just as I explained before how the Chinese responded 10 years ago to their sudden leadership of the global financial system, equally China is grappling at the moment with the collapse in American leadership in the international trading system. So we have an American president who's tearing down the WTO at the moment. The very liberal trading system that we all built, countries across the world, to have a predictable set of rules, to be able to trade and invest, and so that we could see the standards that were applied, and so that there'd be an appellate process, and the whole system would work smoothly. This was designed by the world's nations, led by the United States, and it brought China in. One of the great achievements of, and I have to say, we had to drag Europe kicking and screaming to this, but countries like Australia worked very hard to bring China into the WTO from the very beginning. And the reason was that if China's going to be the world's leading economy, there's no point writing up the rules of the road and not having the biggest economy in there. And China is in there. And China, as it's developed its mentality, its narrative, its way of operating in the last 10 years, has absorbed this. And ironically, China has absorbed the liberal trading order because it is benefiting from it. China actually has benefited enormously from having access to the world's markets and from abiding by the rules of the system. China has been taken to account. It's been held to account on a few occasions by the WTO, and on a few occasions has been found guilty of poor practices, but on many other occasions it has won the battles at the WTO. And China is a convert to the WTO. It has been from day one, and it works in that liberal economic trading system. And today we have the United States trying to tear down that very system. So China has responded in the last 24 hours to these huge tariffs that reminds us of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that the United States kicked off the global depression with. These tariffs that Trump has put onto the world's biggest trading power have been responded in the last 24 hours by China with perfectly proportionate legal responses according to the WTO rules. So this tells you a lot. You've got America tearing down the system, and you've got China abiding by the rules. Now, I'm not saying that China will always abide by the rules, and I think the big risk to us all is that as China grows, it becomes the big bully, and it starts to act in the way that Trump is acting today. It's entirely possible, so I'm not discounting that at all. I think, in fact, we've all got to work on the basis that that is possible, and we've got to find a way to hold China into the liberal trading system. But the best way not to do that is what Trump's doing right now, of course. The big risk we have in the world is that the two great economies of the world divide and tear the system down. If we revert to a system of trade blocks, okay, you guys here in Europe have got your European trade bloc, but actually in the Asia Pacific, which is the centre of the world economy, which drives the world economy, China accounts for 33% of the world's economic growth each year. And if you add all of the other Asian economies, Asia is the centre of the world economy. If you break that system that is fundamentally working and that is holding all those economies together and they're all growing together, you start to create all kinds of problems. And of course, this could well be Trump's intention, because once you create problems and destabilise Asia, once you unstick that cooperation that's working, you can bring back some of those historical threats that exist. Some of the potential instability in Asia is very deep. just as it has been in Europe over the years. Asia has its huge risks. The relationship between Japan and China is a very testy one. The North Korean situation, a madman with nuclear weapons at his disposal. The tensions in the South China Sea, again, where most of the world's trade moves through. It's entirely in China's interest, by the way, to keep that open, because China is the great trading nation. It needs the South China Sea to be open. But if America starts to close it down, I'm parroting the Chinese view here, but this is how they see it. If America threatens their open trading with the world, you have all kinds of potential conflicts. So this is serious. This is really serious. And so for us to very simply and complacently sit back and to frame this as, oh, China is the threat, there may well be some truth to that China may well be a future threat. But we actually ought to sit down and think about how are they seeing the world, because they're pretty important. And unless we understand how they're seeing it, we could well get things wrong. We could well make mistakes if we misunderstand how they're likely to act. And at the moment, my prediction is China's going to act according to the rules of the system. My prediction is the Belt and Road is about working within the system. However, there will be elements of, at a micro level, there'll be corruption and there'll be all sorts of other issues. But at the macro level, I don't think China's a risk to the international trading system, but there is a risk at the moment. And so the issue is how do we make sure that something like the Belt and Road reinforces the international trade and investment system rather than unsettles it?
Well, I have loads of questions still, but I think we should open it up to the audience, because I'm convinced that there will be a lot of questions from the public. Yes.
I was fascinated to see that you don't believe that China is going to tell you what to do. So Australia's economy is incredibly dependent on China's. And Clive Hamilton wrote a very interesting book recently, so I'm curious to know, I'm sure it hasn't been translated into Hungarian. Perhaps you'd comment on that.
Yeah, well, there's a very lively debate going on in Australia at the moment about Chinese influence, because you're right. Australia is the most economically integrated of the G20 economies with China, so it's incredibly dependent upon the Chinese growth, its resources sector, its education sector, its tourism sector, and actually right through all of the economic sectors of Australia, China is fundamentally important. And the other really interesting thing about Australia, like Canada, and other places as well, but Australia in particular, more than anywhere else, has had a very rapid rise in the Chinese proportion of the population. So, and this again it's nothing unusual for Australia, because Australia is a migrant country and does tend to change with every generation. And so Australia's had waves of migrants from different parts of the world. Of course, it was Europeans initially, and then lots of people from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, from other places. But the big wave that's really changed Australia, and will continue changing Australia arguably, is the big wave of Chinese migrants. And the big difference with previous migrant waves into Australia is that, unlike the people who came as Hungarian refugees to Australia, or Vietnamese refugees, or working class migrants from Britain or Ireland or wherever, those people all arrived with nothing. And they worked hard and they worked their way up and they made a big contribution to Australia, and in doing so they integrated into Australian life. Chinese migrants are arriving rich. They're arriving already having made it. They already have lots of money. They already have a great confidence in the country that they come from. They're not leaving it behind and wanting to turn their backs on where they've left, like earlier waves of migrants often did. The Chinese migrant is coming and wanting to maintain the link. In fact, quite often we find that the Chinese migrant is coming and buying the house, settling one partner and the children into the house in Sydney, for example, but then the breadwinner, the person who's earning most money, goes back to China and continues to make money. And this is not an unusual thing in Chinese culture. It's been very common throughout Southeast Asia as well. But what it means is that you've got a very different dynamic happening. And so in Australia today, it's probably in a way ahead of the curve. I think you'll probably see similar things happening throughout the developed world in the next generation as the Chinese middle class move out into the world and invest and trade more and move and live in different places. You'll see that it raises a number of questions. And so one of the questions that it raises in a country like Australia, that's a liberal democracy and has been, for a long, long time, and it now has this incredible economic dependence on China, which is the exact opposite, is this whole geopolitical question. Is China in the future a threat to the broader Western world? Is Chinese investment in Australia therefore something that we should look at more carefully than other kinds of investment? If the Chinese want to run the power system for a state of Australia, is that a strategic industry, for example, and should we perhaps not allow them to, even though we might have allowed a company from another country to do so? Should we not allow China? And that debate is beginning, and there have been strategic sectors in which Chinese investment has been stopped. There have been a few examples as well, because of that movement of people, of people expressing views in Australia that align with a Chinese view of the world. And of course, in a vibrant liberal democracy like Australia, this actually shouldn't disturb people, would be my argument, because people have different views. People always have. And so someone to express a view about China, whether it's a positive or a negative view, is entirely their right. However, we are hearing some voices from people who want to crowd out certain voices, who want to name people as being agents of influence. And this Clive Hamilton book in particular was a pretty nasty book in that it demonised this section of the Australian community as being threats to the community. And so when you take a large proportion of the community and paint them all as being threatening, in a migrant society like Australia, is quite a dangerous thing. So luckily, government, I think, and both sides of politics have managed the thing quite well. I think there was a lot of opportunity to cause mischief and to cause problems in the community, and there has been some name calling and events of anti-Chinese activity, etc., from extremists. But I think it's been on a very small scale, and I think the media has exaggerated it. But there's no doubt that Australia is an interesting test case of what kind of politics can start to be played around these issues of China's influence, what are the economic issues, and what are the national security issues around state-owned Chinese companies being very active in your economy. And Australia's a very good test case because it kind of is ahead of others in dealing with these issues and is still dealing with them. They're very live issues in Australia, so you'll no doubt see occasional news about this. But news, remember, always tends to exaggerate and distort, just as news about Hungary does when it reaches the other side of the world, I'd have to say as well.
Just one remark. I don't think that the Chinese do not want to tell us or anyone what to do. They've been doing that for like thousands of years. China, in its present form, is not some kind of natural nation state. It's an empire that came into being by invading and integrating other countries, nations, people. And it did not really change. I mean, even recently we can hear of more and more stories about Chinese interfering in the affairs of other countries, like in the case of South Korea when they were building this anti-missile system called THAAD, and the Chinese started to boycott the South Korean retail company, and by this influenced the decision made by the South Koreans, or Chinese are exerting great pressure on leaders of other countries in cases like meeting the Dalai Lama or having a formal relationship with Taiwan, or things that are important to China. So I think the Chinese are already trying to tell other countries what to do in affairs that are very important for them. And I think Chinese are in many aspects very unique people, but I don't think that if it comes to power and influence, they act different than any other power in the world.
In the 1970s, I talked to a famous Hungarian politician in the interwar years. And he pointed from a population standpoint, there's two big vacuums in Asia. One was Australia and the other Siberia. Now, he said the Chinese are in some fashion going to move into one or the other or both. In Siberia, I just heard some recently, I guess it was a Polish politician who went on the Chinese side, and he saw this great development that was going on, build up in populations. And on the Siberian side, there was these earthen shacks, and the contrast was tremendous. And the population is very low there. What do you think? Is there a danger? Will they in some way have a design on this area for themselves?
I think this is a very important question, but my question is somewhat different. The first part of your talk was very elevating and optimistic, and I think your second remarks were somewhat less, and the warnings by Mr. Shalat, I think, were very important and so on. But I'm particularly interested in your assessment of Hungary's and Central Europe's chances with China. My impression, which may be wrong, is that China is promising all Central European countries that, well, you will be my favorite. You will be the foundation for my European projects. And very little comes from that, and especially it is not possible to favor everybody. So I think that it's maybe a very dangerous illusion if Hungary thinks that we will be the foothold. And in that connection, I have particular interest in this project, the Belgrade-Budapest fast train. I have looked into this question, and I found that by train, Chinese goods can reach Europe much faster than by the sea route. And the other problem is that there is no usable railway line between Greece and Belgrade. So we may build a fast train, a beautiful one, but there will be no traffic because the goods cannot reach, or it would take a long time. So it may be a project which is very important warning for Hungary.
Yes, I'll start with the first question about the risk or the threat of Chinese expansionism. And I think in the long term, we do have to be very careful about what happens with a new rising power. So I don't think any of us can predict what's going to happen in the long term. But my prediction for the short term is that the government of China, the ruling party state in China, has a whole lot of problems to deal with that would prevent it, I think, from focusing on any sort of external adventurism. This is not the United States, which needed to grow and needed to expand and dominate new territories to grow its economy. China actually has plenty of scope still to grow within China, in the west of China, and because of the liberal trading order that we talked about before, China has plenty of scope to grow through building these beneficial links with other countries. There's no geopolitical demand for China to expand its territory, would be my argument. Also, China is very focused on retaining what it has. So, it's got the Taiwan problem that it considers belongs to it, and that it presumably expects one day to return to the motherland. It's absorbed Hong Kong and Macau on a much smaller scale. It is holding on to areas in the west of China, Xinjiang and Tibet, that are quite restive. There are serious problems in those areas that is taking a huge amount of security attention and human rights problems, as we know. So there's a huge focus on just maintaining stability within the borders that China has, or within what it considers to be its borders. And also its economic growth. And of course it needs that continued economic growth to hold the regime together, because their constant fear, as any authoritarian regime has, this fear that it's going to lose its hold on power. And there's no doubt that there's that fear that again, not in the short term perhaps, but in the medium term, that as China gets rich, that there'll be pressures for the regime to change. And so there's enormous pressure to keep focusing on delivering the economic benefits and distributing them and demonstrating the public good. So I don't buy it that there's any great benefit for China in going off on military adventures elsewhere. I think it's too much of a risk that actually it could unwind the things that they're achieving to date. I think in your comment in relation to, I won't talk about Siberia because I don't know so much about it, but in the case of Australia, yes, I agree. Australia, my view is Australia could do with some more people. I think as a continent nation, it would make sense if our aspiration was to have more people and to play a greater role. I have enough confidence in my own country's political system and values to think that we would be better as well if we were larger, and we'd be stronger and we'd be more able to defend ourselves no matter what future risks there are. So clearly that's, and most Australian elite decision makers would agree with me, and that's why Australia runs a high immigration policy, for example, and has done since 1947. And it's been one of the world's great success stories in doing so. And because when those people come, they do integrate well, and they commit to that political system and its social values. So in terms of is Australia a big vacant lot that China needs? It doesn't need to invade, because it can build the economic links, and in fact there will inevitably be more and more Chinese people in Australia. There are 1.2 million people of Chinese background living in Australia today in 2018. I'm sure in 50 years' time it'll be many millions, and that's just a natural thing that's going to happen through a natural process. It doesn't require an invasion and doesn't have to be a threat, because those people will contribute and will commit to the values of the country they move to, I'm sure. If they don't, then we'll have a problem, but that's something that has to be managed politically. Then to come to Central Europe. Look, I think you're absolutely right. I think the Chinese way is that they like to make you feel like you're the favourite. And the Chinese are amongst the most hospitable people in the world. Their culture is one of hospitality. You know, Marco Polo brought that message back to Europe when he brought all the fabulous food and everything back as well. He was received, you know, as we all are. When you're a foreigner and you go to China, and this is what Viktor Orban finds, it's what any business leader finds, anyone who goes to China, you are feted, you are looked after with such kindness and keen interest, and you're given huge banquets to eat, and the hospitality is enormous. You're given gifts, and the people sitting across the table from you make you feel like you're so special. And because at that moment you are, because they're actually absolutely learning about you, they're trying to learn what they can, they're trying to figure out, can they develop a relationship with you. And so there's no doubt you walk away from the Chinese banquet. If you're a Prime Minister, you come away from your first visit, your second visit, your third visit, convinced that you are their favourite. But Viktor Orban's not the only one. Every world leader is convinced that they are the favourite of Xi Jinping, because he makes them feel that way. And it's not. There's nothing cynical about it. This is Chinese culture. They're not intending to trick you. It is literally just the way they take you to heart, and they look after you and they feed you well. They are looking for business opportunities, and so yes, they want to develop a relationship with you. And I think this is the challenge here, is to find what are the real business opportunities that are viable for each country. And so in your case, what are the viable projects that you want? How could you access the Chinese capital to build something that you need? So if it comes to a railway, I don't know, I'm not the expert on railways in Europe, but presumably from the Chinese perspective, they're looking at it a bit differently. They are taking the long approach, because in China, over the last 40 years, what they've done is they have built it, and then the people have come and they've
found the business opportunities from the infrastructure that's been built. So that phrase in English, build it and they will come, is very much the Chinese mentality. Build the huge road, build the huge port, the airport, build all the infrastructure, put the railway in. I mean, I've been to relatively small towns on fast trains in China. It's phenomenal. I come from a country, Australia, with 25 million people, most of whom live down in one straight line down the coast, and we don't even have one fast rail line in Australia. But in China, they have so many hundreds of them now, going to tiny little places in comparison with the big cities. But the Chinese mentality is, we'll put it all there, and then the business opportunities will flow. Once the infrastructure's there, like the Americans 100 years ago building their railway, a bit slower, but the same process. It opened up opportunities. And so that's their thinking. They're thinking, look, there's a big gap in north-south connectivity in Europe, and we've got the capacity to build it, let's build it. But it could be that your planners and experts in logistics and market development here in Hungary may well be scratching their heads and thinking, well, actually, how can we make this benefit us? And that's the question you've got to ask, not what is the Chinese vision, how's it going to benefit you? I wish I knew the answer to that, but I do think asking the question is the key point. That's the advice I give to the countries I work for in the Pacific, that yes, the Chinese are offering all this funding, but we've got to figure out, what do we want? What's going to benefit us? And actually the Chinese will respect that, because they don't make the announcement just for the sake of the announcement. They do want to see results from the relationships they've built. So I'm sure the Chinese want to see infrastructure development in Hungary, but they're going to need Hungary to tell it precisely what's going to work.
Just a few words about this Budapest-Belgrade railway. It will be completely useless unless a railway is built between Greece, Piraeus and Belgrade, but the Chinese don't really care, because it's us who pay for it, not them. It's already good for them. It doesn't really matter if actually there are trains going on this railway. But in the long run, they are planning for the new railway, fast railway between Belgrade and Piraeus. Actually, there are some preparation for that, but the preparation just stopped because of the domestic policy issues in Macedonia. But when those are settled, then I think the railway between Greece and Belgrade will be built. And the other question about everybody being the favorite of the Chinese, I think the solution is quite simple. All the decision makers in the region should take part in some Chinese communication 101 course, like maybe one Saturday afternoon, something like that. And people who actually communicate with Chinese should teach them that Chinese communicate in different way than us. When they say something, it does not mean what they actually say. It's not because they are lying, it's their culture. They don't say no. When they say yes, it doesn't mean yes. Stuff like that. We can teach them in 2 hours. But the problem with decision makers is that they believe they are decision makers because they became decision makers because they are much more clever than anyone else. So they don't need such kind of trainings. But I think that would be useful for them. Sorry for the ministers in the room.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. My name is Sándor Kerekes. In the 1890s, there was a very deep and serious crisis in the political life of the United States due to the part of the politicos wanted to expand the Philippines and Cuba. Others thought the country, the founding ideals of the country don't permit this. They lost, and we know what happened. Now, you say the same thing. So I am proposing a corollary to that, what you just said. We know that, we don't know, actually. Is there a political idea, a political creed in China that prevents it from being an imperialist state? And how does that square with the expansion they are already practicing for 10, 15, 20 years in Africa? Because they are under a double-fold pressure. On the one hand, they want resources, easy. And on the other hand, they have a lot of people they have to put somewhere. I don't know exactly how much room is there left in China for all these people? They released the one-child rule now. They no longer insist on that. So there will be an increased population growth, I suppose. No? Okay, well, fine. Nevertheless, so is there a political creed that prevents them from becoming an imperialist state, an imperialist power, or will they be happy to rob everybody of the resources and just use it all up at home?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very good question because you're absolutely right. If we look back at American history, America flipped. It went from being quite isolationist to then developing this ideology of expansion, and of course by the time of the World Wars in the 20th century, that was developed into a very elaborate ideology of exporting freedom and democracy to the world, and arguably that lasted for a long time. It was used as the justification by George Bush for invading Iraq and various other things. So it was a very powerful ideology that ruled America for a long time. It may be in the state of evolving into some different ideology at the moment. Who knows? It may not. It may come back again in the post-Trump era. But America's a good example of how a great power can adjust its ideology when it becomes a great power. It can move from being relatively self-obsessed with then wanting to actually change the world into its image. And certainly the Americans are not alone in that. The British Empire was a classic example of that as well. So will China do that? China does have a creed at the moment of not being an imperialist power. They're very proud of that. Xi Jinping makes it very clear in every speech he gives about international relations that China will not be a hegemon. He always says that. We seek win-win cooperation. We want to have respect and mutual interests between countries. The language he uses is not the language of wanting to export a model. Now, of course, language and actions can be two totally different things, but if we're talking about ideology, the ideology of China, there's no doubt, is a confidence in its own civilization and its own history that they believe they've never been an imperialist power. Now, there would be some on the periphery of China that might beg to differ, of course. Some on the periphery were forced into tributary relationships in the past with China, and there are some who would say something rather similar is happening today in places like Cambodia. And you could make the same criticism in places like Africa as well, where the enormous economic influence that China has, is it a form of neo-colonialism? Well, I think it's a matter for discussion. I mean, it certainly does put China into a position of having a lot of power, not as much power as Europe used to have in Africa, because it's not military power, but certainly it's economic power. Are those companies and is the government using that power to do something that is of an imperialist construct? I don't think it is yet, would be my answer to that. I think yes, there have been some poorly designed projects, and yes, there's been some corruption. There have also been some very good projects. I was talking to the leader of the China Communications Construction Company recently, who was telling me, if it's true what he was telling me, he was saying that they employ 10 locals for every one Chinese person that they take to Africa, and they're one of the biggest players in Africa. And if that's true, that's a huge contribution they're making to local economic development. Now, it may be that everything's going to say made in China and everything's going to have Chinese branding, and so the media we all consume as people who are in the non-Chinese world, the media is telling us that this is a neo-colonialism because, of course, America and others in Europe want us to think that because it used to be Europe's patch. So there are multiple ways of looking at these things. I don't know what the long-term answer is, though, because your question is a critical one. Will China flip like America did? China may well be committed today to not wanting to rule the world, but who knows? 50 years and 100 years, will they? 25 years, will they? Well, obviously, we've got to be planning on the basis that they might. They have one aircraft carrier. They have one international base. So we do have to put it into perspective. They don't have any capacity at the moment to rule the world. America rules the waves. It has the aircraft carriers. It has 200 international bases. America rules the world. But the question is, in 25 years, when China will be much bigger than the American economy, It already will pass the American economy in the next 10 years. So in 25 years, in 50 years, Chinese military capacity, Chinese ideology could be very different from what it is today. So definitely these are questions for the future, but they're not questions of today.
Just a few remarks about demography. We all are scared about the demography of China, but actually the population of China will reach its peak in a few years, and after that it will decline. And the lifting of the one-child policy, which has never been actually a one-child policy, does not change that. Children are just not born in China, so the population is aging. It will be shrinking very soon, and the working age population has already shrinked since, I think, 2012, which will probably stop or slow down the outward migration of Chinese. As for your other question, actually there are some theories that say that Xi Jinping is doing exactly the same thing that President Theodore Roosevelt has done in the 1890s. The way China is now actually occupying the South China Sea, though those islands are very similar to how the US occupied Cuba and the Philippines and all the islands surrounding it. So I think when the Americans are criticizing China for doing this, they should look back to their own history, because they have done that not so long ago.
Okay, I'm very sorry because I've remained with a lot of questions. One about the Budapest-Belgrade or Belgrade-Budapest railway, and about the path it's coming or is going to go. But I think it's worth examining these questions at another occasion. And I know, yeah, unfortunately, our time has been up for quite a while, but you're welcome to ask any questions directly of the speakers. So I'd like to thank you for coming and see you at our next event.